Okay, Tyler Mahan Co. here with a review of George and Tammy, Episode 4, The Grand Tour. Right out of the gate, I don't think it's possible for me to overstate how much George Jones did not give a single solitary shit about number one hit records. This TV series is messing with the timeline of what really happened in so many different ways that it's difficult to tell what year they're trying to show us in any given scene. But since they seem to be saying Jones had not hit number one with a solo record when he separated from Tammy that December, this is another lie. The Grand Tour was released as a single the previous January and hit number one that summer, many months before the separation. I'm guessing they reversed the order of these events because they believe the song The Grand Tour is about divorce and want to make it seem as though it became a hit because fans knew Jones and Tammy had separated. Not going to spoil anything for those of you who've recently begun listening to Cocaine and Rhinestones, but to say the least, the Grand Tour is not as simple as all of that. Of course, as keeps happening on this series, the truth is it was really Tammy Wynette who became obsessed with number one hits, and more importantly, more consequentially, obsessed with not having number one hits because she believed her failure to consistently do so meant her career would soon be over. This episode of the TV show takes about 5 different things that happened several years apart and causes it to seem as if they all took place within about one 48-hour period, making any kind of in-depth fact check on all of this total nightmare. Surface level coverage here, though. There was an incident when Tammy claims George Jones destroyed their house and shot a gun at her. This happened years earlier at their home in Florida. And when the neighbor she herself claims was there was asked about it many years later, he did not say a single word about a gun and went so far as to suggest that based on what he had seen of the house, it must have been Tammy herself who destroyed it. Perhaps so Jones would see the damage when he was released from the asylum, assume he had done it himself, and believe Tammy was justified to leave him in a straitjacket while she went to tour in Canada. Because this show makes it seem like Jones was beating the shit out of Tammy all the time, I guess I should say he admitted to slapping her one time. I looked into every source on every story that had to do with anything to do with both of them, and I concluded that that time was most likely the time that they were living in Florida and Tammy's daughters ran over to the same neighbor's house and said that Tammy and George were fighting. By the time the neighbor got over there, George had already split, and Tammy was just saying over and over again, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. When you go look at all of the available sources, a lot of people who are around all of the time say that Tammy would routinely start physically hitting George Jones. She would get mad at him and start hitting him. This is maybe personality, maybe has something to do with the fact that she was prescribed speed, which, heightens aggression. Who knows? I would say the truth is this was not a great relationship, abusive in both directions for several reasons. I don't think it's fair to say that George Jones was constantly hitting Tammy Wynette when it seems like the truth is it was the other way around. And also this is maybe kind of one of the problems with casting a giant of a man to play someone who in reality was quite small. Tammy Wynette was probably well capable of physically beating the shit out of him. But yeah, back to this episode. The thing where Tammy takes George Jones' car keys away so he won't go get liquor and he rides a lawnmower to get liquor did happen. It's just that it almost certainly happened between Jones and one of his earlier wives back in Texas. I think I said this in a previous review, but again, Tammy Wynette was known to take stories she believed were pretty good and pretend they had happened to her or she was somehow involved, which is probably what happened here. While we're on the topic of the Lawnmower story, which I have always hated because it is nearly always told as if it's just a funny little thing that happened rather than an account of harrowing alcohol addiction. There's this very stupid thing that Steve Earle has been saying for several years about how George Jones wasn't on the Lawnmower to get booze because Nashville bars and liquor stores close at whatever hour, and this supposedly happened in the middle of the night, so he must have been trying to get cocaine. Yeah, everyone needs to stop repeating that because A, there's very little chance this happened in Nashville, and B, even if you'd like to believe it happened while Jones was still married to Tammy, Jones never even tried cocaine until after he was divorced from Tammy. Always been a stupid thing to say. It's still a stupid thing to say. Stop saying it. But George Jones and Tammy Wynette did actually separate just before Christmas. So here's what really happened. They were at the studio recording in Nashville when Peanut and his wife Charlene stopped by. George went over to talk to them, and Tammy, in her head, began freaking out because she thought George would go with the Montgomerys, get drunk, disappear, and not be home in time for what they had planned that Christmas. Well, that's not what happened. George came back from talking to the Montgomerys, finished the recording session, and went home with Tammy. Her anxiety then shifted from worrying over Jones getting drunk to worrying about how long it had been since she had a #1 hit. She kept Jones awake the entire night, rambling, dumping all these baseless fears on him. What about this? What about that? What happened then? And this and this and this. She claims this was the only time she ever did this, but even in her own autobiography, there are all kinds of hints. This was probably a pretty regular occurrence. In fact, the argument Tammy and Jones had years earlier in which he told her they were just going to have to hold on, prompting Peanut Montgomery to write the song, began with her worrying that their fading record sales signaled the end of their recording careers. So, yeah, Tammy's paranoia was a fairly consistent source of stress for Jones. And on this particular night, he had been white-knuckling it for so long, trying to meet her expectations, that not getting any sleep was just too much. And he got up the next morning, grabbed his overnight bag, and went to a hotel room with a bunch of bottles and got drunk by himself for several days. This is all it took for Tammy Wynette to file for the very real divorce, which wound up going through in January. It was not some big blow up like they showed in this episode of the TV show, but trying to depict what really happened would involve making it clear how much this marriage was initially based on two addicts becoming mutually infatuated with fantasy versions of each other that were never gonna become real, no matter how much either of them tried to make it work. You know, one thing I see fans saying in order to convince themselves this is a good TV show is that it's not supposed to be a documentary. Well, sure, nobody ever thought it was gonna be. The problem is not that this isn't a documentary. The problem is this TV show fails to capture the spirit of who these people were, why they did the things that they did, and what it meant that they did the things they did. There are many great TV shows based on true events that are not documentaries, that also do not simply dramatize history exactly as it happened in order, scene by scene. The important thing these shows do that makes them great, though, is recreating the spirit of what happened. For example, the HBO series Deadwood. When they went to make Deadwood, they needed to communicate how rough around the edges nearly all of the people in that camp at that time would have been, but they also realized if the characters spoke exactly the way those frontiersmen and gold miners and sex workers spoke, then it would play as comedy. They'd all be walking around talking like Yosemite Sam, swearing with words like "Dad Blarnit," which back then was some of the rudest shit you could say, but today is merely laughable. So for Deadwood's modern audience, the show had those characters speak in some of the rudest language you could use today, and it translated a spiritually correct vibe while not technically being period correct vernacular. Another example would be the show The Great on Hulu about Catherine the Great coming to power in Russia. This show intentionally exaggerates and modernizes the way its characters speak and the way they behave in order to communicate a spiritual truth, which is how alienated Catherine must have felt by the culture of Russia in that period and why she would in turn do the things she did. George and Tammy forsakes the truth of its history, not in order to communicate any spiritual truth, but because of what looks to me like a combination of laziness and a failure to understand what is actually interesting and important about this story. If the show's creators understood what is interesting and important about this story, I do not believe they would be telling it this way. The biggest oversight this series has made so far is not merely to represent Tammy as a blameless victim and George as a worthless bastard, but to entirely miss that the parts of this story the TV show isn't making up out of nowhere were part of a fictional narrative carefully packaged and sold to the public by Tammy Wynette, George Jones, Billy Sherrill, and all the songwriters Billy had writing songs to sell this image, which included George Ritchie and Peanut Montgomery. All of these people, all of these real people, worked very hard and very deliberately to create a fantasy version of this marriage that they could sell to the fans. That includes the beginning, when it was in the honeymoon phase, the middle, as it started to get rocky and that leaked to the public, and at the end and after the end. They were still selling a version of this relationship the whole time. Not only is that the real story, it's the most interesting thing that happened here. How did a couple of country singers and the Nashville music industry concoct and market a soap opera version of those country singers' real lives in real time on the albums themselves to millions of people, many of whom today still believe it was all some kind of behind-the-scenes documentary on this relationship? And if you don't think so now, today, right now, just go on your own social media and make a post about how wild and incredible it is that George and Tammy continued working together so long after they were no longer in love with each other anymore. If you happen to be friends with a significant number of people who believe they know this story, it will not be very long until someone shows up to explain to you that George and Tammy were always in love with each other. They were in love with each other until the day that they died. If you do this, and when that person shows up to be loudly wrong, just point them to George Jones' autobiography, in which he talks about how much he grew to hate working with Tammy. This is not a difficult fiction to debunk. And for an example of what this show misses by not even trying to get into this aspect of the way this story was delivered to the public, you know how in the previous episode they made such a big deal of Jones and Tammy finally getting a #1 record on the song "We're Gonna Hold On"? Okay, well, one of the reasons that record was so successful cannot coexist with events as they were shown in this episode or any episode that we've seen so far. It cannot coexist with events as we're being told they played out. Tammy Wynette was not talked into preparing a divorce she maybe didn't really mean after Jones destroyed their home that Christmas before the separation. Years earlier, Tammy hatched a plan to file a fake divorce, which she claims was intended to scare Jones into getting sober. She also claims the public was never meant to find out about this fake divorce. but they did because filing it entered the paperwork into public record. Whether you believe either of those claims, the way this TV show takes the fake divorce, Jones getting drunk at Christmas, trashing the house, the lawnmower story, all of this turning into the real separation that led to the real divorce, mashing all of that together to make it seem like one event glosses over the part where these things all happened over several years in separate incidents, which did not cause Tammy to leave, at least partly because she was trying to stick to the behind the scenes of George and Tammy's marriage narrative she and so many others had worked so hard to sell to the public. Up until the fake divorce was filed and became public information, the entire narrative of Jones and Tammy's duet singles had exclusively been that they were made for each other and the marriage was nothing but pure bliss, blah, 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 blah. And here's where the conspiracy theory minded among you are free to argue your lungs out because we'll never know the truth of how artfully orchestrated this may have been. But the same month, the media and the public learned that Tammy Wynette had filed for divorce from George Jones, Billy Sherrill released We're Gonna Hold On as a single. This is the first George Jones and Tammy Wynette single that intimated anything was remotely wrong in their marriage, released the same month that the public found out Tammy Wynette filed for divorce from George Jones. George and Tammy announced they were going to stay together, and that single shortly became their first #1 duet. Pretty crazy story, right? Seems like anyone who understood these people and was tasked with making a TV show ostensibly about their real lives would tell that part of the story, right? Aside from not understanding its subjects, the reason I'm going to go further and call this show out on being downright lazy is this most recent episode directly plagiarized my work on Cocaine and Rhinestones, and in my opinion, plagiarism is about the laziest act a writer can commit. I saved this for the end of the review because I'm not trying to pull a Lenny Bruce and hold you hostage while I read details of what may very well soon be evidence in a court case. So those of you only interested in my review can tune out here. But for those of you interested in the particulars of how this show just ripped me off, in 1966, George Jones did an interview in which a reporter asked for the suggestions Jones would give to aspiring country singers who want to follow in his footsteps. Here is George Jones' response, as quoted in Bob Allen's 1984 biography. Quote, "I wouldn't advise them to. Oh, I love country music, but there's always somebody wanting something, wanting you to do something. You're constantly in demand. There's no seclusion, or rather there is, but not when you really want it. When you're out with friends or in a party or out in the public, that's the main time you really find yourself wanting some privacy, but there's no way in the world to get it. Then, when you're not working, after about 3 or 4 days, you start getting restless. And that's all due to nervous tension. You want to be out again, moving around and seeing people, playing and singing. If I could have made a living doing some other things, I know I would have been a lot happier. I would have had more peace of mind. You don't get that in this business." End quote. Jones was never the most articulate guy, and it takes him a while to figure out what he's trying to say there. So when I referenced that interview in the post-opening credits scene of the 7th episode of Cocaine and Rhinestones' 2nd season, this is the episode titled Pappy Daly, Gene Pitney, and How George Jones Came to Be on MusicWar. Rather than use that direct quote, I took the meaning of what Jones was trying to say, and informed by other statements he made throughout his life, I wrote it up like this. And I'm going to place emphasis on things you will not find anywhere in the George Jones quote I just read, because these are the things that magically found their way into this episode's script. 1966, a reporter asks George Jones what advice he'd give to country singers trying to become a star like him. Jones' advice is essentially, don't. He says he knows he would be a happier person if he could make a living doing anything else. He then gives some reasons why. When you're a country star, everyone wants something more from you, even and especially if you've already given them everything you've got. You'll have very little control over whether you spend the whole day surrounded by strangers who want to talk to you or alone in a hotel room, and nobody will care much which one you feel like doing on any given day. Even though you don't like these sudden shifts between pandemonium and isolation, you'll soon acclimate to the point where one doesn't feel right without the other. So whenever you do take some time off, instead of rest, you'll probably just get restless. But you can't just call up some friends to go hang out somewhere, or else you're right back to being reminded how much privacy you no longer have. End quote. In this episode of George and Tammy, also in the post-credits opening scene, almost as if they liked where I placed that content for them, they have George Jones in a barroom saying, quote, "I've been noticing things about this life, being a star. Not the kind that guides the wayward traveler who brought the wise men to Jesus, but I'm talking about the kind that's forced to live down here on earth, and the kind that everybody wants something from. Some more and more and more, even if, especially, you've already given everything you've got to give. And in return, you get no control. No control over whether you spend the day surrounded by strangers wanting to talk at you or alone in a hotel room. And guess what? Nobody cares much which one you feel like doing on any given day. And even though you don't like these quick shifts between pandemonium and isolation, it gets to where you're just so dang used to it, one doesn't feel right without the other. So when you take your time off, instead of rest, you just get restless. That's where the trouble starts." End quote. Roughly half of that is not some shit George Jones ever said, because it's taken directly from what I wrote to describe the way he felt. I doubt George Jones even knew the word pandemonium, and if you run a search for that word in quotes and his name in quotes, the first thing that comes up is the Cocaine and Rhinestones transcripts of the episodes where I used that word to tell his story. Then below that, you'll find some lazy-ass reviews ripping off this TV show's ripoff of my original work. I know a lot more about what percentage of copied material comprises actionable plagiarism in the world of songwriting, but you'd better believe I'm not going to be quiet about this no matter what it turns out I can do about it. And you'd also better believe I'm going to have a lawyer look into this scene and any further instances of this show stealing from me. It's bad enough how many people already assume I was involved in this disaster being on television. Now they are blurring the lines even worse by taking words I wrote and putting them directly in George Jones' mouth. The other fucked up thing about that scene is while Michael Shannon delivers my work, there's a recording of the real George Jones singing on the jukebox in the background. Half of the responses I've seen to complaints over the singing in this show boil down to how expensive it would have been to license the original recordings and have the actors lip sync or blend their voices with AI. Then why is there a George Jones song in the background of this episode? How were the previous episodes able to afford major hits by Merle Haggard and Waylon Jennings when there's also no earthly reason why songs by either of those artists need to be in this show? They were somehow able to find room in the budget for that. Man, it is exhausting watching people bend over backwards to defend the things they were told are true, the things they want to believe are true, the sources they want to believe are the best sources for this story, instead of just looking at something that is clearly horseshit and saying, that's horseshit. I wonder what really happened there. Oh, wow, here's an incredible story over here. Why doesn't anybody know this part of all of these things? I do want to say thank you to everyone out there who is able to receive new information and update what you think you know about things instead of wholesale rejecting anything that conflicts with what you would like to be true or with what is said by the people you want to believe. It seems like this is a really rare thing. I really appreciate those of you who are able to change your minds after learning the facts. On a similar note, the next thing I have become morbidly curious to see in this TV show is how the hell they're going to pull off the total 180 they will need to do on the character they've come up with for George Ritchie. No spoilers, but that is bound to cause some mental whiplash for a lot of viewers fairly soon. Yeah, stay warm out there, stay safe, try not to get robbed. Apparently, it's happening all over the place these days. And I will be back soon with a review of the next episode of George and Tammy, which I'm sure is gonna be just awesome.